Kia ora, kouwhasmithaho, nā mai ki te whare, welcome to the House. Among Parliament's many committees, there is one that we've mentioned a bit recently in both articles and in audio, but which is little known and even less understood. So it seemed like a good idea to get an introduction to it, its powers, its purpose and its work. And for that, I chatted with the committee's chair and deputy chair. Arena Williams is the Labour MP for Mandarewa, and Nancy Liu is a National Party List MP. For this committee, by convention, the chairperson always comes from the opposition. So I began by asking Arena Williams for a brief outline of her committee, the Regulations Review Committee, mostly known as Regs Review.
The committee is one of three committees which is not like a normal subject select committee and has a sort of cross-partisan way of working. The other two are the Standing Orders Committee and the Business Committee. So Regs Review is special because it was set up in 1985 and has always been chaired by a member of the opposition. It is responsible for secondary legislation and how regulation works.
Regulations, Nancy. Thankfully, they're only called that mostly now. They used to be called all sorts of things, but most people actually have no idea what they are. Explain them.
Well, acts are made by Parliament in Parliament, and I think that's as most punters on the street and New Zealanders would understand. But also within acts and legislations, it also gives other departments or ministers some power to make and provide the details of those legislations. For example, fees, or timing, or things that are necessary for people to really understand the details that don't necessarily have to block down or slow down the timing of processing and passing legislations in-house.
So regulations are the things that happen as a result of the delegated authority that comes from what we call primary legislation, the bills that actually pass in the House. Why do they come to you? Why do you review them?
Well, like Kalina said a bit earlier, it's a very special select committee. It's not the subject ones that we have in Parliament. And also it's actually a very powerful select committee. Basically, we want good lawmaking and we want ministers and departments who have the power to make regulations actually make good use of their power and make good regulations for New Zealanders. Now, so sometimes things come to us because there are maybe inappropriate use of the power in making regulations, or there are complaints from New Zealanders, and therefore it is our job to look at it bipartisan across and with one common purpose, which is better, good lawmaking.
Yeah, because it's not about policy so much, is it? It's always about that sort of more fine-grained stuff. So you can look at it without worrying about the party politics too much. And sometimes you choose which ones to look at and sometimes they're given to you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes they're complaints about how a regulation is working. And I want to give you an example. So most New Zealanders will come up against the law, but it'll actually be in regulations. It won't be in a primary act. So if you've ever tried to, say, install a toilet in your bathroom, you will have run up against what's in the building code. It's not actually in the primary legislation. But that building code has a big impact on your life if you're trying to renovate your bathroom or your kitchen. So most New Zealanders would expect that somebody in here that they can talk to, their local MP or a minister who they have elected to be in the government, has some kind of control over what those rules are, and we want to make sure that they are sensible rules that you can follow. That's the role of the Regulations Review Committee. You can either complain to us and say, hey, I should be able to do this and this sort of bathroom work at my home, or the regulations that apply to the electricity that I'm getting through the electricity code don't seem to make sense, don't seem to be competitive, it doesn't give me the cheapest price that I should be paying. That's the kind of thing that we will deal with. Often it's also for professional bodies. If your job is something like a plumber or a nurse, you'll have a professional organisation that looks after the standards you need to adhere to. That's all set through regulation making power, and often the complaints that come to the committee are about the fees that you pay in the year to be able to do your job and the sorts of complaints procedures that'll apply to you.
Nancy, you called it a powerful committee. What kinds of things can you do?
Our power is to be able to tell off some ministers that they haven't really followed good regulation making and good lawmaking principles. And in that way is very powerful, because I think it's very important for us to remember legislations and acts are made in the House, but also how far does it go? How do people read into, the normal day-to-day New Zealanders read into legislations and how it impacts their daily lives? That's very different.
You're a governing party MP, though. You're a national MP.
Yes.
This sounds juvenile, but it still occurs to me that it could be bad for one's career potentially to
That's a good question.
to piss off a minister by saying, you did your job badly. You need to fix this bill, this regulation.
And I think that's what it makes the Regs Review Select Committee powerful and very unique in its way. And I think it's needed because we want to make sure that we are using our powers within the appropriate realms and to make sure that we're setting good laws. And so maybe, hopefully, that by calling them out or by investigation, by what we do as a team on the Select Committee, that we work through the complaints or bad lawmaking, and so we can actually rectify or make it better in that way. So most of the feedback that we have received from our ministers and ministries have been actually quite positive. You know, mostly around, hey, thanks for letting us know. We didn't realise that, but now we know, and, you know, we'll make it better next time. So
you actually have some legislative powers as well, don't you, in terms of taking stuff back to the House and asking the House to do things about things.
We have the power to disallow regulations. And so that's, if you're a member of the public and you come along and you've complained about your electricity bill, you don't think that's a fair price, and you think you can make out a complaint about those regulations applying in the wrong way, then we can make a finding that the code is not acceptable and we can disallow a certain thing. And that was actually what happened earlier this year when a motion was moved by Joseph Mooney, he's a National MP, to disallow a series of rules that were set around legal education and what can be taught in universities, particularly around tikanga Māori. That was a really interesting debate. It was one that caught the attention of a lot of people because a law that had been enacted by a government and then the regulations that followed that were seen to be by this committee an overreach. But can I give you a bit of a context? And when this was set up in 1985 it was in the fourth Labour government's term by Sir Geoffrey Palmer, regulation making was getting to be seen by the public as an overreach in itself.
It was kind of government by regulation, right?
Absolutely. The power of the executive was seen as a bit out of control. Your fruit and your vegetables, your trip in your car, it was all heavily regulated. And so the reason for this committee was, well, if we do believe that regulation is out of control, then we need a power for elected officials who get chosen every 3 years by their communities to actually strike that down. And so that's what that disallowance power is about. Anyone in Parliament can move a motion to disallow a regulation, and often secondary legislation is referred back to the House through this mechanism. And so it was enabling this public sense of a sort of pressure valve needed to be able to turn off some of that over-regulation. It's been used 9 times since it was introduced. I think it's a really useful power for the Parliament to have, and you've seen it used to great effect in this term, and I think we'll see more of that from the committee.
The reason it's only been used 9 times, though, is because a lot of your power is soft power, right?
Ding, 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 bingo.
It's about, I mean, as Nancy was saying, getting ministers to change it by themselves without having the House strike it down, or by fixing it before the bad stuff goes on, by seeing the bills as they come through that are going to enable the regulation, and where those powers are, you know, a little bit bigger than they ought to be or need to be, something like that.
That's 100% true. Most of the committee's power is soft power because it's cross-partisan. I mean, that's the importance here, is that we are able, me and Nancy, to work together to chair the committee in a way which gets buy-in from everyone around the table. It's getting harder in an MMP environment when we have minor parties that have more sway in any executive government agenda or indeed in opposition politics. And so it is really great that we have Dr. Junan from the Greens coming along to every meeting and participating in that. We don't have an ACT member who comes to the committee, and we need more of this ability as parliamentarians to come together and go, hang on, does this regulation make sense? Let's do something about it if it doesn't.
Yeah. There's a constitutional aspect of this, which involves the difference between the executive and Parliament. When the public thinks about government and who's in charge, everyone presumes that it's the government and the Prime Minister, but it's not. They bring laws to Parliament, but it's Parliament that actually approves them. Parliament's actually the boss,
Yes.
right? And so one of the potentially problematic aspects of regulation is that the laws that come from the executive, the government, that have not been approved by Parliament. And so you're a kind of a check on that, right?
We do act as a check. So Parliament passes legislation. Then it is up to the executive team, basically the government and the beehive, to execute, obviously based on the government agenda, but also in accordance to what the legislation allows.
Yeah.
That allows government to have that ability to push forward that agenda. However, in the areas that they have fallen behind or have missed a number of steps or have simply unintentionally excluded or have forgotten to include certain things, it is up to us to make sure that we keep that standard upheld tight. And there is absolutely no dispute between anyone, Parliament or MPs or clerks or government, that the ultimate goal we have is we want to make sure that there is good law making. Full stop.
It's the ultimate goal for a good MP. Whoever's law it is, whether they agree with the law or not, they want the law to be well written. In your committee recently, you've been having some hearings to try and figure out how the power of your committee intersects with a bill that's before Parliament at the moment, the ACT Party bill from David Seymour, the Regulatory Standards Bill, which seems to be potentially a bit of a double up of powers, or at least intentions. Tell me about that, Anina.
Yeah, the committee's been thinking deeply about how its powers to review regulation sit alongside this proposal to introduce a regulatory standards board. You know, essentially the committee acts like that, but it has this special constitutional place and traditions that have been built up over many years around the way that we consider whether regulations are doing what they say they will do on the tin. We're also got the advantage of being people who have to go out in our communities and represent ourselves to the people we serve, and they get to put us back into Parliament or not every 3 years. It's a special part of the committee, and it makes us all quite focused on, you know, these things like, how does this really affect someone's life? Does the price that a nurse pays for her re-registration actually reflect the value that she's getting from her professional body? These things are things that we deal with every day because we go and speak with these people. And so thinking about how an executive board that has power to examine not only secondary legislation but primary legislation from the perspective of a particular set of rulemaking principles might overcut our committee's work has been pretty challenging. And it will ultimately be this committee and the Standing Orders Committee, which has to make some decisions and probably some accommodations in this parliamentary term about how to work alongside. But ultimately, I would say that in our constitutional framework as it is now, that this committee has a sort of system of constitutional preference about how it should engage in those issues.
Yeah. Presuming that bill passed, you would end up with two versions of committees that did similar things, but one of them worked for the executive and the other one worked for the Parliament.
Yeah.
Obviously, your committee would have supremacy in the same way that Parliament has supremacy, but you'd potentially be sort of pulling in different directions, wouldn't you? I mean, depending on who the executive was at any given point, right?
There is certainly risk, and it's something that we are actively discussing within our own Regs Review Committee, but also across different committees, and I'm sure within parties as well. The risk of making sure that the bill, or once it passes, that it is not undermining or duplicating or in other way conflicting or giving two different directions to what our work is on the Select Committee. But I think it's still developing, it's still early stages, it's still going to evolve a little bit more. And it's a space to watch, and I encourage listeners to come back to our version, our podcast number 2 maybe a bit later in the year.
I really want to see the Regulations Review Committee as somewhere where we can agree as all parliamentarians, including ACT members, that this is a special part of our constitutional framework. I think New Zealand is onto the good stuff here when we've got parliamentarians who turn up every week earnestly and diligently to work through secondary legislation from the perspective of how it's affecting our communities. That's really special. If, you know, this minister is raising that there is too much regulation and that there's not a strong enough mechanism to disallow regulations, then this is the place where I think we should be focusing our attention. And we're thinking about that deeply. There's lots of perspectives on that. And ultimately, I think it's right for Parliament to have that kind of discussion through our committees like the Business Committee and like the Standing Orders Committee. These are the most senior members of the House. The Business Committee is chaired by the Speaker. These are sort of fundamental questions that almost sit alongside our constitutional arrangements. You know, they make up the patchwork of law, which is our foundational documents. Because at the end of the day, we all have to be able to live with the system that we're in. And, you know, not to say something too nice about David Seymour, but he is raising questions about how we deal with these issues. I think, though, that the energy that he should be putting into this is improving the systems through this mechanism so that it's parliamentarians who are accountable to the people who are ultimately making the decisions.
That was Labour MP Arena Williams and earlier National MP Nancy Liu, both talking about Parliament's quite unusual Regulations Review Committee. You've been listening to The House. E te whakarongo koe ki te whare. This program is produced with funding from Parliament's Office of the Clerk. Mā te wā.